1:15 in the morning. The Syrian border. A platoon of United States Army Rangers was already pressed into the jagged rocks of a dry wash. This was not the expected outcome of a routine reconnaissance patrol. The air was thick with the sharp tang of ozone and the smell of pulverized limestone. The Rangers had moved into the border region to monitor supply lines. They found a professional ambush instead. The morning air was heavy and still. High above, the moon was a thin sliver that offered little light to the men in the dirt. The Syrian desert stretched out, in every direction, a landscape of gray shadows and hidden dangers. Below the ridgeline, the Rangers had established a thin perimeter. It felt fragile. This mission was different from the dozens they had conducted in the previous month. Usually, the sky above the Al-Tanf garrison was crowded with American drones and electronic surveillance aircraft. Tonight, the digital link was dead. The primary radio frequencies hummed with a flat, rhythmic hiss. Someone had brought sophisticated electronic warfare equipment to this remote stretch of sand. The Rangers were technically alone. Lieutenant Miller adjusted his night vision goggles and looked toward the eastern ridge. He could see the heat signatures of at least 30 men, moving with military precision. These were not local militia members. They were using high-end thermal masking and moved in synchronized fire teams. The lieutenant realized his unit was facing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The lieutenant spoke into his short-range radio. Lead. This is 3. Our long-range link is dark. I cannot reach the Combat Information Center. The platoon sergeant responded from a position 20 meters away. Confirm. The jamming is localized but intense. We are boxed in, sir. They are closing the gap from the north and the south. We need a window, Miller said. His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. If we cannot get a signal out, we are just a target in a ditch. 1:16 in the morning. The first heavy machine gun began to bark from the high ground. Large caliber rounds hammered into the sandbags and rocks, protecting the American position. The Rangers did not immediately return fire. They were conserving ammunition and waiting for a target they could identify. Every man in the platoon knew the math. The nearest air support was a pair of Apache gunships at a remote outpost 40 miles away. Even at maximum speed, those helicopters were 6 minutes away. 6 minutes was an eternity when the perimeter was collapsing. The IRGC forces began to leapfrog forward. They used the terrain perfectly, moving during the bursts of machine gun fire. They were professional. They were patient. They knew. The Rangers were cut off from their overhead support. 1:17 in the morning. A signal technician crawled toward the lieutenant. He was carrying a portable satellite burst transmitter. It was a secondary system, designed for emergencies when the primary masts were jammed. Sir, the technician whispered, I have a narrow window. The jamming has a cycle. Every 30 seconds, there is a pulse. I can try to punch a distress code through during the gap. Miller looked at the ridgeline. A mortar tube was being set up in the distance. Do it. Tell them we are pinned. Tell them we need the Reapers now. The technician waited. He watched the flickering signal bar on his handheld device. The jamming pulse hit, filling his screen with static. Then, for a fraction of a second, the screen cleared. He hit the transmit button. The data burst was small. It contained a set of coordinates and a single code word. It was a request for immediate kinetic support. The technician looked up. Signal sent. No confirmation received. Miller gripped his rifle. The silence of the desert was about to be shattered. The first mortar round whistled through the dark air. It landed 40 meters to the south. The ground shook, and a column of dust rose into the sky. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 1:17 in the morning. A remote operations center in Jordan. The distress signal appeared as a single red icon on a wide digital map. It was a jagged pulse of data that had survived the electronic interference of the Syrian border. In the darkened room, a communications technician sat upright. He adjusted his headset. The icon was blinking over the coordinates of the dry wash where the Rangers were pinned. The technician turned to his supervisor. Major, we have a priority burst from the border region. It is the Ranger Reconnaissance Platoon. Major Vance moved to the console. He looked at the short, coded message. A kinetic support request. They are under fire. The signal is weak, sir, the technician said. They are being jammed. I cannot establish a two-way link. The major looked at the status board. Where is our closest air cover? The Reapers are at the forward arming point. They are 40 miles out. They are not fueled for a long loiter. Tell them to launch, Vance ordered. If Miller is burning a satellite burst, he is out of options. Get the Apaches in the air. 1:18 in the morning. 500 meters from the American position, an Iranian commander named Maleki stood behind a low stone wall. He watched the dry wash through high-definition thermal binoculars. To his eyes, the American Rangers appeared as glowing white silhouettes against the cold purple of the desert sand. Maleki was a professional. He had studied American small unit tactics for a decade. He knew that the moment his men opened fire, a clock had started ticking. He also knew that his electronic warfare teams were successfully drowning out the primary American radio bands. But he knew the Americans were resourceful. He spoke into his radio in a quiet, measured tone. The first mortar was a ranging shot. Correct your elevation by 2 degrees. We must collapse their southern flank before the sun rises. His subordinates responded with short, disciplined acknowledgments. On the ridge, the mortar team adjusted the heavy steel tube. They dropped a high-explosive round into the muzzle. 1:19 in the morning. Inside the wash, the world exploded. The second mortar round struck the very edge of the ravine. A wall of dirt and jagged rock collapsed into the American position. The blast wave was a physical hammer that knocked the breath out of the men. Through the ringing in his ears, Lieutenant Miller heard a cry of pain from the left flank. He crawled through the thick dust. His vision was clouded by the debris. Report, Miller shouted. Status on the left. A voice came back through the chaos. Davies is down. He has shrapnel in his leg. We have a heavy bleed. The platoon medic, a specialist named Rivera, was already moving. He stayed low, dragging a heavy medical kit through the loose gravel. He reached the wounded ranger and began to work by touch in the dark. I have him, sir, Rivera said, but we are wide open over here. The blast took out our cover. Miller looked up. The IRGC infantry was no longer leapfrogging. They were moving in a steady, disciplined line. They were less than 200 meters away. They were coming to finish the job. The lieutenant grabbed his radio handset. He did not know if anyone was listening. He did not know if the signal would clear the ridge. Control. This is 3. We have a casualty. The perimeter is compromised. We are engaging with small arms. Where are those birds? There was no answer. Only the flat, dead hiss of the jamming. On the eastern ridge, the Iranian commander saw the movement in the wash. He saw the Americans clustering around their wounded. It was the moment he had been waiting for. Maleki keyed his radio. Advance. All units. Close the distance now. The desert night was no longer silent. The heavy rattle of machine gun fire and the scream of incoming mortars filled the air. The 6-minute clock was down to 5, and for the Rangers in the dirt, 5 minutes looked like a lifetime. 1:18 in the morning. A remote forward arming and refueling point. The siren was a sharp, mechanical scream that cut through the desert silence. In a small plywood hut near the flight line, Chief Warrant Officer Miller dropped his coffee and grabbed his flight vest. His co-pilot, Captain Sarah Vance, was already out the door. They did not need a briefing to know what the alarm meant. The red light on the perimeter fence was flashing. That meant a kinetic emergency. 2 AH-64 Apache gunships sat on the concrete pads. Their dark, insect-like shapes were barely visible under the dim security lights. The ground crews were already pulling the chocks and disconnecting the external power units. Captain Vance jumped into the front seat of Reaper 1-1. She began the rapid start sequence. The auxiliary power unit whined to life, a high-pitched drone that echoed off the nearby hangars. She flipped a series of switches on the overhead panel. The cockpit displays flickered into existence, casting a ghostly green glow over her flight suit. Reaper 1-1. Powering up, Vance said into her helmet microphone. Miller climbed into the rear seat. He buckled his harness and adjusted his integrated helmet display. A series of digital numbers and symbols floated in front of his right eye. He checked the fuel levels and the weapons load. They were carrying 16 Hellfire missiles, 2 pods of 70mm rockets, and 1,200 rounds of 30mm ammunition. Reaper 1-2 is turning, Miller said, looking at the helicopter on the adjacent pad. The engines are hot. We are ready to pull pitch. 1:19 in the morning. The main rotor blades of the Apache began to sweep through the air. The sound changed from a whine to a heavy, rhythmic throb. The dust on the flight line was kicked up into a swirling cloud. Captain Vance watched the torque meters. She felt the vibration of the powerful engines through the floor of the cockpit. The controller's voice crackled in her headset. Reaper 1-1. This is Control. You have a priority tasking. A Ranger platoon is pinned down, 40 miles to the north. Their long-range comms are jammed. You are cleared for an immediate departure. Copy. Control. Vance replied. 40 miles. What is the threat level? High, the controller said. The Rangers report multiple mortar positions and a disciplined infantry force. Be advised. The electronic environment is hostile. You may lose GPS as you approach the border. Understood. We are moving now. 1:20 in the morning. Captain Vance pulled back on the collective. The Apache groaned as it lifted off the concrete. The nose dipped forward, and the gunship accelerated into the black sky. Behind her, Reaper 1-2 followed in a tight formation. Inside the cockpit, the 2 pilots were already doing the math. 40 miles at a transit speed of 150 knots meant a flight time of 16 minutes. But they were not flying a standard transit. They were flying a combat dash. Vance pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, and the airspeed indicator began to climb. 160 knots, 170 knots. We can be there in 6 minutes if we push the airframe, Miller said. He was already slaving the nose-mounted thermal camera to his helmet. The screen showed the desert rushing by below them. But the fuel burn will be critical. We will have less than 10 minutes of station time. 10 minutes is enough to break an ambush, Vance said. Her voice was steady. Tell the Rangers we are on the way. If they can hear us, tell them to hold the line for 360 seconds. The 2 gunships banked toward the northern horizon. The lights of the outpost faded behind them. Ahead was nothing but the vast, empty darkness of the Syrian border. Somewhere in that darkness, 20 Americans were fighting for their lives in a dry creek bed. The 6-minute clock had officially started. 1:20 in the morning. 3 miles inside the Syrian border. Inside a darkened command vehicle, Commander Maleki watched a high-definition monitor. The feed came from a silent drone hovering high above the combat zone. The American Rangers were trapped. To Maleki, they appeared as small, pulsing, white ghosts huddled behind the jagged rocks of the wash. This was not a random skirmish. This was a calculated play for strategic leverage. Maleki did not want a massacre. A pile of bodies would bring a full-scale American retaliation. He wanted something else. He wanted a trophy. A high-ranking American Army Ranger held in a secure facility would be a powerful bargaining chip for his government. Maleki spoke into his headset. His voice was calm and melodic. Alpha Team, move to the northern lip of the wash. Bravo Team, close the southern exit. Do not use heavy ordnance on the center of their line. We need the commanding officer alive. Disable them. Do not destroy them. 500 meters away, the situation for the Rangers was deteriorating. Lieutenant Miller looked at his digital ammunition count. His men were down to their last 3 magazines of 5.56mm rounds. The heavy machine gun on the right flank was nearly dry. The rhythmic thud of the enemy weapon fire was getting closer. Miller adjusted his position. He saw the pincer movement through his thermal optics. The heat signatures were no longer just in front of them. They were sliding around the sides like a closing set of jaws. The Iranian force was disciplined. They were not rushing. They were suffocating the American position. Miller spoke to his platoon sergeant. Sergeant, they are cutting off our retreat. They are closing the box. The sergeant crawled closer. His face was covered in gray dust. "Sir, if we do not move, in the next 2 minutes, there will be no way out of this hole. We are going to be overrun." Miller looked at the wounded ranger. Specialist Davies was pale. The medic had applied a tourniquet, but Davies could not walk, let alone run. Moving him in the open under this level of fire would be a death sentence for the entire medical team. "We cannot move Davies," Miller said, "and I will not leave him. We stay. We hold the center." "Sir, they are within 100 meters," the sergeant said. He swapped a fresh magazine into his rifle with a metallic click. "If those Apaches do not show up, this becomes a hand-to-hand fight in about 60 seconds. Miller gripped his rifle. He looked at the sky. He could not see the helicopters yet. He could not hear them over the roar of the Iranian machine guns. But he knew the pilots. He knew the speed of the AH-64 Apache. The lieutenant spoke into his short-range radio. "All units, fix bayonets. Conserve your rounds for clear targets. Nobody gives up an inch of this dirt." On the ridge, Maleki saw the Americans tightening their circle. He saw they were no longer trying to retreat. He smiled. They were brave, but they were outmatched. He keyed his radio for the final order. "All teams, advance. Take the center." The Iranian infantry rose from the shadows. They began their final rush toward the wash. The air was filled with the scream of incoming fire and the shouts of men. The 6-minute window was almost closed. 1:21 in the morning. The ridge above the wash. The Iranian commander, Maleki, decided to shorten the window of engagement. He had observed the American mortar fire and realized the Rangers were likely down to their final rounds. He signaled to a specialized weapons team near the center of his line. 2 men moved forward with a heavy tube-shaped canister. They were deploying a Russian-made Kornet anti-tank guided missile system. This was a significant escalation. A guided missile was overkill for a group of light infantry in a ditch, but Maleki was not taking any chances. He wanted to suppress the American command element completely. The missile team set the tripod on a flat shelf of rock. The operator pressed his eye to the thermal sight. He began to paint the large boulders near Lieutenant Miller with an invisible laser designator. Inside the wash, the Rangers felt the change in the air. The incoming machine gun fire shifted from sporadic bursts to a continuous roar. It was a base of fire designed to keep their heads down. Lieutenant Miller looked at his mortar team. "Status on the tubes." "Sir," the mortarman shouted over the noise, "we have 2 rounds of high explosives left. That is it. After that, we are a rifle squad with no heavy teeth." "Wait for my command," Miller said. "I want them closer. If we miss now, we miss for good." 3 miles to the south, the 2 Apache gunships were screaming through the night air at 180 knots. The sound of the twin turbines was a deafening howl. Inside the cockpits, the pilots felt the airframes shaking. They were pushing the limits of the mechanical components. The transmission oil temperature gauges were climbing into the yellow zone. Captain Vance looked at her targeting display. The localized jamming was still thick, but the thermal sensors on the nose of the Apache were beginning to pick up the heat signatures of the battle. She could see the rhythmic flashes of the Iranian machine guns and the steady, cool glow of the American position. "Reaper 1-2, Vance said to her wingman. "I have the visual. The IRGC has the high ground. They are preparing a heavy weapon launch on the eastern ridge. I see the laser scatter." "Copy. 1-1. The wingman replied. "I see it. That is a guided missile tripod. They are going to level that wash." "Not on my watch," Vance said. Her voice was cold and professional. "Increase speed to maximum. We are 30 seconds from the engagement envelope. Master arm is on." "Master arm on," the wingman confirmed. "I am slaving the 30mm cannon to my helmet. I have the ridge in sight. 1:22 in the morning." On the ridge, Maleki raised his hand. The missile operator had a solid lock. The green light on the control unit was steady. The Iranian infantry was crouched, ready to sprint the final 50 meters the moment the missile struck. "Launch," Maleki ordered. The Kornet missile ignited with a violent roar and a massive cloud of white smoke. It streaked across the dark desert floor, a bright orange star trailing a thin wire. It was moving at over 300 meters per second. In the wash, Lieutenant Miller saw the flash. He knew he had no time to move. He threw himself into the dirt and covered his head. "Incoming!" he screamed. The missile covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. It struck the rock face 3 meters above Miller's head. The explosion was massive. A wall of fire and shattered granite erupted into the sky. The concussion knocked every ranger in the center of the line unconscious for a heartbeat. The Iranian commander did not wait for the dust to clear. He blew a whistle, a shrill sound that cut through the thunder of the explosion. "Go!" Maleki shouted. "Capture the officers! Move now!" The Iranian infantry rose as one body and charged down the slope. They were screaming as they ran, their boots pounding the hard-packed earth. They were 20 seconds away from the perimeter. The morning was no longer quiet. It was a cacophony of fire and death. The 6-minute clock was at 01:22 in the morning. The dust was a thick, choking curtain. Lieutenant Miller tried to sit up. His vision was a blur of gray and red. His ears were ringing with a high, steady whistle that drowned out the world. Through the haze, he could see the silhouettes of the Iranian infantry. They were 30 meters away. They were running. They were screaming. They were almost at the lip of the wash. He reached for his rifle. It was buried under a layer of pulverized rock and sand. His hands were shaking. His fingers felt like lead. "Sergeant!" Miller croaked. "Up! Get up!" The sergeant did not move. He was slumped against a ruptured sandbag. To his left, Specialist Rivera was trying to reload his pistol with one hand. The other was pressed against a head wound. The American perimeter was not just breaking. It was gone. The lead Iranian soldier reached the edge of the ravine. He was a young man in a black tactical vest. He raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at the American commander. He paused for a fraction of a second to steady his aim. 1:22 and 30 seconds in the morning. A sound like a giant tearing a sheet of heavy metal filled the sky. It was the rhythmic, terrifying bark of the M30mm chain gun. From the blackness to the south, a stream of tracer rounds stitched a line across the desert floor. These were not bullets. They were explosive shells. Each one carried enough force to shatter a light armored vehicle. The lead Iranian soldier disappeared in a cloud of red and black. The line of fire swept across the charging infantry. The desert floor became a killing zone of fire and flying stone. The Iranian charge did not just falter, it evaporated. The survivors threw themselves into the dirt, desperate for cover that did not exist. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 11, Captain Vance gripped the collective. She felt the vibration of the chain gun through the airframe. The smell of cordite was sucked into the cockpit through the vents. Reaper 12. "I am masking behind the southern ridge," Vance said. Her voice was a flat, professional monotone. "You take the high ground. Clear that mortar position on the eastern slope. I want that ridge sanitized." "Copy. 1-1. Engaging with rockets." The second Apache banked hard to the right. It loosed a volley of 19 Hydra rockets. They streaked through the air in a terrifying, erratic swarm. The eastern ridge disappeared in a series of massive orange fireballs. The Iranian mortar tube was tossed into the air like a piece of scrap metal. 1:23 in the morning. Commander Maleki crawled away from his shattered command vehicle. The thermal drone feed was dead. His radios were screaming with the sounds of dying men. The ambush had been perfect. The electronic jamming had been flawless. But he had forgotten the one thing that changed every equation in the desert. The Americans would always come for their own. He looked up. 200 feet above the desert, the two gunships hovered like prehistoric predators. Their sensors were turning. Their guns were searching. "Regroup!" Maleki shouted into a handheld radio. "Use the shoulder launchers! Now!" An Iranian soldier stood up from behind a jagged rock. He rested a Strela missile launcher on his shoulder. He waited for the heat signature of the Apache to lock. He was a brave man. He was also a dead man. In the back seat of the lead gunship, the sensor operator saw the man's heat signature bloom on his screen. Gun. 12 o'clock. Missile threat. Engaging. The 30mm cannon pivoted with a mechanical whine. It followed the operator's head movement with perfect precision. Vance pulled the trigger. A short, 5-round burst silenced the threat before the missile could even arm itself. The Apaches began to circle the wash. They were low, they were loud, they were lethal. The downdraft from the massive rotors kicked up a fresh storm of sand, blinding the retreating Iranians. The Rangers in the dirt looked up, through the smoke and the chaos. They saw the green and red navigation lights of the lead helicopter flicker once, a signal, a promise kept. Malecki looked at the two helicopters. He knew the mission was a total loss. He keyed his emergency frequency. All units, total withdrawal. Break contact. Move north into the dead zone. Now, the gunships hovered over the wash, their cannons slaved to the pilot's eyes. They waited for the next move. They waited for the final stand. 1:23 in the morning. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 1-1, Captain Vance leaned into her targeting eyepiece. The crosshairs were centered on the heat signature of Malecki's command vehicle. The laser designator was a steady, invisible needle of light. The Hellfire missile was armed and ready to launch. Target locked, Vance said. Her thumb hovered over the red launch button. Reaper 1-2. Take the northern technicals. I am taking the command element. On my mark. Copy. 1-1. Locked and ready. Suddenly, the green glow of the cockpit displays turned to a blinding, solid white. A high-pitched, piercing tone screamed in Vance's headset. Then, there was total silence. The helicopter groaned. The engines did not fail, but the advanced flight control systems reverted to primitive manual backups. The nose of the Apache dipped sharply. Vance fought the controls to keep the gunship from falling into the sand. Miller! Vance shouted to her co-pilot. Report! What just happened? My screens are dead, Miller responded. His voice was strained. The targeting computer is offline. I have no weapon lock. I have no laser. Everything is blank. 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning. On the eastern ridge, Commander Malecki reached for his digital binoculars to witness the destruction of his command post. He saw nothing. The high-resolution display was a sheet of static. He ripped the goggles from his face. His men were shouting in the darkness. Their night vision devices had fused. The thermal tubes were burning, hot against their skin. The entire Iranian force was suddenly blind in a landscape of pitch black. The electronic jamming they had brought to the fight had been replaced by a massive, all-encompassing electronic whiteout. Commander! A voice crackled through, a low-frequency radio that somehow still functioned. Our vehicles are unresponsive. The ignition systems are fried. We are immobilized. Malecki looked up at the sky. He expected to see the Apaches raining fire. Instead, he saw the two helicopters struggling to maintain a hover. Their navigation lights were dark. They looked like two wounded birds fighting to stay in the air. 1:24 in the morning. In the dry wash, Lieutenant Miller and his Rangers looked up. The terrifying roar of the 30mm cannon had stopped. The world was eerily quiet, save for the heavy throb of the Apache rotors. What are they doing? The platoon sergeant whispered. Why aren't they firing? They can't, Miller said. He looked at his own night vision. The image was grainy and dying. Look at the sky. High above the battlefield, 30,000 feet in the air, a single point of light appeared. It was not a star. It was not a satellite. It moved with a smooth, silent speed that defied physics. It was a massive radar signature that appeared for 1 second on the American AWACS circling 100 miles away, and then it vanished. The pulse had not just affected the weapons, it had paralyzed the will of the combatants. 1:24 and 30 seconds in the morning. A direct, hardened signal bypassed the dead screens in Reaper 1-1. A text-only message flickered onto a backup navigation display in the cockpit. It did not come from their local control center. It was a command from the highest levels of the United States military. Code Red, CEAC fire. Disengage immediately. Do not pursue. Repeat. All strike operations are terminated. At the same moment, Maleki's handheld radio emitted a single, sharp tone. A voice from Tehran, sounding panicked and breathless, spoke a single word in Farsi. Withdraw. Now. Do not. Look back. The pivot had arrived. The battle for the border was no longer a tactical engagement between two professional forces. It had become something else entirely. Both sides had been stopped by a power that neither side understood. The sky returned to a deep, empty black. The mysterious light was gone. 1:25 in the morning. The cockpit of Reaper 1-1 was a tomb of green shadows. Captain Vance reached for the manual reset breakers. Located behind her right shoulder, her movements were jerky and precise. The smell of scorched plastic hung in the recirculated air. Miller spoke from the back seat. Systems are cycling. I have partial power to the flight director. The targeting computer is still looping. It looks like a hard logic crash. Vance looked out the canopy. Below them, the desert was a void of absolute black. The jamming is gone. The radio silence is gone. But the order stands. We are not to engage. Confirm, Miller said. Control is repeating the directive. We are to provide top cover only. No kinetic solutions unless we are fired upon. 1:26 in the morning. In the dry wash, Lieutenant Miller stood up. His legs were heavy. He looked toward the eastern ridge. The heat signatures of the Iranian force were moving away. They were not running in a panic. They were moving in a disciplined, staggered retreat. It was the movement of a professional force that had been told the mission was over. The platoon sergeant approached him. He was limping. Sir? They are breaking contact. Why are they leaving? We were dead in the water. I do not know, Miller said. He looked at the sky. The birds are just sitting there. Something happened. Something shifted the ground under our feet. The sergeant looked at his handheld device. The screen was flickering back to life. I have a signal. Long-range comms are up. Control is asking for a status report and a casualty count. Tell them we have 1 urgent surgical and 3 walking wounded, Miller ordered. Tell them the enemy is bugging out to the north. Ask them who gave the ceasefire. 1:27 in the morning. Across the ridge, Commander Maleki climbed into a secondary transport vehicle. His primary command truck was a smoking ruin, but not from a missile. The electronic systems had simply melted. He watched his men melt into the shadows of the Syrian interior. His radio crackled. It was the same voice from Tehran. It sounded older, more tired. The voice spoke. Commander, you are to return to the base at Palmyra. Do not speak of the light. Do not speak of the pulse. The Americans are receiving the same instructions. This event did not happen. Maleki looked back at the wash one last time. He saw the Rangers gathered around their wounded. He saw the silent, hovering shapes of the Apaches. He had been seconds away from a historic victory. Now, he was part of a secret that he knew would never be told. The Iranian commander sat back in the seat. Copy. We are clear of the engagement zone. Returning to base. The two forces, which had been locked in a struggle for survival moments ago, were now separating like oil and water. There was no victory. There was no defeat. There was only a profound, heavy confusion. 1:28 in the morning. Captain Vance watched the last of the thermal signatures vanish into the northern hills. She felt a deep, unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the cockpit temperature. Reaper 1-2, Vance said into the radio. Do you have eyes on the retreat? Confirm. 1-1, the wingman replied. They are gone. The zone is cold. We are staying on station until the medical evacuation arrives, Vance said. Keep your sensors wide. I do not care if the computer is crashing. Use your eyes. I have a feeling we are not the only ones watching this desert tonight. The desert returned to its natural state of silence. But the silence felt different. It was the silence of a room where someone had just stopped speaking. 1:28 in the morning, the dry wash. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of a transport helicopter began to grow from the west. An AH-64 Pavehawk from the Air Force Special Operations Command was coming in low, hugging the desert floor to avoid any remaining radar threats. Inside the wash, the Rangers were ready. Lieutenant Miller clicked a single infrared strobe into the on position. To the naked eye, the desert remained dark, but to the pilots in the air, the wash suddenly pulsed with a steady, invisible heartbeat. The Rangers formed a tight circle around Specialist Davies. The medic, Rivera, kept his hand on the wounded man's shoulder. He was monitoring the tourniquet in the dim light of a red-filtered flashlight. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the ambush was beginning to fade. It was replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. "The bird is 1 minute out," Miller said. He looked at his men. Their faces were caked in gray dust and dried sweat. "Check your sectors. We are not out of the woods until that ramp is up." 1:31 in the morning. The Pave Hawk flared over the wash. The downdraft was a violent storm of grit and loose stone that forced the Rangers to squint and turn their heads. The helicopter wheels touched the uneven ground for only a second. 2 pararescuemen jumped from the side doors before the dust had even settled. They moved with the mechanical speed of elite professionals. They reached Davies, secured him to a specialized litter, and hauled him toward the open door. The entire transfer took less than 45 seconds. Lieutenant Miller watched the Pave Hawk lift off. It banked hard to the west, disappearing into the darkness. The wounded were gone. Now, it was just the remaining 18 Rangers, and the walk to the extraction point 3 miles away. 1:34 in the morning. High above, Captain Vance watched the scene through her backup thermal camera. The image was grainy and flickered with static, but she could see the heat signatures of the Rangers as they began to move out of the wash. They were moving in a tactical column, heading south. "Reaper 1-2, Vance said into the radio. "The ground team is mobile. We have 2 minutes of fuel before we hit our bingo limit. We stay until the last second." "Copy, 1-1, the wingman replied. "I am scanning the north. I have intermittent heat signatures on the horizon. They are watching us." "Let them watch," Vance said, "as long as they stay on their side of the line." 1:37 in the morning. 2 miles to the north, Commander Malecki stopped his vehicle on a high plateau. He stepped out into the cold desert air. He did not use his digital optics. He held a pair of traditional glass binoculars to his eyes. He saw the dust clouds from the American helicopters. He saw the faint, ghostly shapes of the Apaches hovering over the border. He also saw something else. On a ridge 5 miles to his east, a single, tall silhouette stood against the stars. It did not move. It did not carry a weapon. It simply looked toward the battlefield. Malecki lowered his binoculars. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. "Sir," an officer whispered from the vehicle, "the drones are back. The American high-altitude surveillance is active. We must move. The Americans are leaving," Malecki said. His voice was hollow. "And so are we. This was a test, and I think we both failed." 1:39 in the morning. The 2 Apache gunships dipped their noses and began their transit back to the Jordanian border. They flew in silence. The electronic environment had returned to normal. The GPS was accurate, the radios were clear, but the data from the last 10 minutes was missing from their flight recorders. It was as if the pulse had deleted the memory of the machines. Lieutenant Miller led his men across the flat expanse of the border zone. They did not look back. They did not talk about the light or the sudden silence of the guns. They were soldiers. They focused on the next step, then the step after that. The crisis had fully resolved, but as the sun began to hint at the eastern horizon, no one felt like they had won. 4:15 in the morning. The Al-Tanf garrison. The heavy steel gates of the outpost swung open to admit a line of dust-covered vehicles. The 18 men of the Ranger platoon sat in the back of the transport trucks, their heads bowed, their rifles held loosely between their knees. 3 hours had passed since the final shot was fired, but the silence of the desert still seemed to cling to their uniforms. The air inside the garrison was cool and smelled of diesel exhaust and industrial cleaning fluid. For the men who had been in the wash, the transition to the safety of the base felt surreal. They moved like ghosts through the staging area, heading toward the medical tent or the debriefing rooms. Lieutenant Miller was the last to disembark. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. and his face was a mask of gray limestone dust. He was met on the tarmac by Major Vance and a team of intelligence officers. "The casualty is in surgery," Vance said, walking alongside the lieutenant. "Rivera did good work. Davies is going to keep his leg." Miller nodded slowly. He did not look at the major. He looked at the horizon, where the first hint of a pale blue dawn was beginning to erase the stars. "They were waiting for us, Major." It was a professional setup. They had the jamming, the heavy weapons, and the numbers. "We were 6 minutes away from being a memory." "I know," Vance replied. Her voice was low. "We are already analyzing the sensor data from the Reapers." The response time was 5 minutes and 42 seconds from wheels up to the first engagement. "You held a collapsing perimeter for the duration of the gap. That is going to be studied for a long time." 4:30 in the morning. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Analysts were huddled around flickering screens, trying to reconstruct the events of the engagement. There was a glaring hole in the data. For exactly 60 seconds, every digital record from the border region was awash of static. "Sir," one analyst said, looking up at the major, "we are getting the same report from the AWACS crew. They lost the track of the Apaches and the IRGC drone simultaneously. Then, they picked up a high-altitude signature moving at Mach 6. It was gone before they could get a firm lock." Miller stood at the back of the room, a bottle of water in his hand. "And the ceasefire? Who authorized it?" Vance hesitated. She looked at a secure terminal on the far wall. The order did not come from regional command. It originated from the National Military Command Center. It was a global override. Every asset in the sector was told to stand down at the same moment the Iranians were told to withdraw. "Why?" Miller asked. "Because someone or something pulled the plug on the fight," Vance said. "The strategic assessment is that a third party intervened, not with weapons, but with the display of electronic dominance that paralyzed both sides. The higher-ups are calling it a localized atmospheric anomaly, but nobody in this room believes that." 500 miles to the north, in a secure facility outside Palmyra, Commander Maliki sat in a small, windowless office. He was writing his report by hand. He had been ordered not to use a computer. His hands were still steady, but his mind was racing. He wrote about the courage of his men. He wrote about the precision of the American gunships. But when he reached the moment of the light, he paused. He remembered the tall, silent silhouette on the ridge. He remembered the feeling of being watched by something that viewed both armies as nothing more than insects in the sand. He crossed out the last 3 lines of his report. He wrote a single sentence instead. The objective was not achieved because the environment became untenable for modern warfare. The tactical debriefing continued for hours. The 6-minute gap would become a legend among the Rangers, a testament to the thin line between survival and disaster. But the mystery of the ceasefire would remain a shadow over the garrison. The sun was now fully above the horizon. The desert was red and gold, beautiful and indifferent. The men went to sleep, but their dreams were filled with the sound of a tearing sheet of metal and a light that turned the night into day. 3 days later, Washington. The morning light filtered through the heavy, blast-proof glass of the Pentagon. In a secure briefing room on the 3rd floor, a brigadier general stood before a digital display that showed a frozen frame of the Syrian border. The image was grainy, a composite of satellite data and the final seconds of the thermal feed from the Apache gunships. The room was filled with senior intelligence officers and electronic warfare specialists. They were not looking at the combat. They were looking at the data gaps. "The 6-minute gap," the general said. His voice was tired but steady. "That is the window the Iranians were testing. They wanted to know exactly how long it took for us to put a pair of AH-64 Apaches over that specific coordinate in the dry wash. They got their answer. 5 minutes and 42 seconds from the first distress burst to the first 30mm engagement." An analyst raised a hand. "Sir, the strategic assessment from the field is that the IRGC was not trying to destroy the platoon. They were attempting a snatch and grab." They were seconds away from a successful extraction of a United States officer. The general nodded. And they would have succeeded if those pilots had not pushed their airframes to the breaking point. But that is not why we are here. We are here to discuss the minute that followed. He tapped a key. The screen went white. At 5 minutes and 52 seconds into the engagement, every electronic sensor within a 50-mile radius was neutralized. It was not a jammer. It was a total suppression of the electromagnetic spectrum. We have confirmed with our counterparts in Tehran through back channels. They suffered the same blackout. Their command vehicle was bricked. Their drone was dropped. Their night vision was burned out. Do we have a source, sir? Another officer asked. No. The general replied. And that is the political fallout. Neither side can claim a victory, and neither side can accuse the other of using a forbidden weapon. If we admit we're blinded, we admit a vulnerability we cannot fix. If the Iranians admit it, they admit they lost a high-value mission to an unknown variable. 3 days later, Tehran. In a mirrored room overlooking the city, a senior commander of the Quds Force sat across from a technological advisor. The report on Maleki's mission sat on the table between them. It was marked with a Bix red stripe, indicating it was for the eyes of the Supreme Leader only. The Americans are reinforcing the Al-Tanf perimeter, the advisor said. They have doubled the number of gunships on the flight line. They have deployed new radar arrays. They are behaving as if they expect a second ambush. The commander leaned back in his chair. They are afraid, not of us. They are afraid of the same thing we are. They saw the light. They felt the pulse. They know that their technology, which they believe makes them gods of the battlefield, can be turned off like a lamp. What of Maliki? The advisor asked. He is being reassigned, the commander said. He saw too much. He talks of a figure on the ridge. He talks of a feeling of being judged. We cannot have our field officers thinking like poets. The two men looked at the map of the border. The lines were the same. The soldiers were the same, but the strategic reality had shifted. The ambush near the Syrian border had started as a test of American response times. It had ended as a revelation. In the high-level Balochistan offices of both nations, the same conclusion was being reached in silence. The next war would not be won by the side with the most advanced computers. It would be won by the side that could still fight when the computers were dead. The political fallout was a quiet, desperate scramble to harden systems against an enemy that had no name and no flag. The border was silent for now, but the tension was no longer a simple matter of two nations at odds. It was the tension of two rivals who had both realized they were being watched by something far more capable. The strategic assessment was clear. The 6-minute gap had been closed, not by the Apaches, but by an intervention that had reset the clock for everyone. 1 week later, 2:30 in the afternoon. The sun sat high and heavy over the Al-Tanf garrison. On a small patch of gravel near the medical station, the men of the Ranger platoon stood in a loose semicircle. They were clean, their uniforms pressed, their boots polished. The dust of the Syrian border had been scrubbed away, but the memory of the dry wash remained etched in their expressions. Specialist Davies sat in a wheelchair at the center of the group. His leg was heavily bandaged, but his color had returned. He looked at his teammates with a quiet, steady pride. There were no medals being handed out today. There were no speeches from high-ranking officials. In the world of special operations, the most significant rewards are the ones that never make the evening news. Lieutenant Miller stepped forward and placed a hand on the shoulder of the medic. Rivera, you did your job, specialist. You kept him with us during the gap. Rivera looked at the ground. The birds did the heavy lifting, sir. We were just holding the door open. They did, Miller agreed. He looked up as the low, rhythmic throb of a helicopter echoed from the flight line. But they only had a door to fly through because you didn't give up the center. 2 miles away, on the tarmac, Captain Vance and Chief Miller walked toward their Apache gunship for a routine patrol. The airframe had been inspected and cleared for flight. The engineers had found no physical evidence of the electronic pulse that had paralyzed the aircraft a week prior. On paper, the incident did not exist. The official logs recorded a successful mission with a minor equipment malfunction due to extreme heat. "Do you think they found anything in the data?" Miller asked as he buckled his flight vest. Vance looked at the cockpit canopy. "They found exactly what they wanted to find. A reason to spend more money on hardened electronics. But they didn't find an answer for what we saw on the sensors. Some things are not meant to be quantified by a computer. It changed the math," Miller said. 6 minutes used to be the gold standard. Now, 6 minutes feels like an eternity if the lights go out. Then, we learned to fly. In the dark, Vance said. She climbed into the front seat. Clear. The engines of the Apache whined to life, a familiar and comforting sound. The gunship lifted from the concrete and banked toward the north. It was a fond, silent promise to the men on the ground. 6 minutes, no matter what. Strategic analysts would later refer to the engagement as a turning point in the gray zone conflict between the United States and Iranian forces. The ambush proved that no matter how sophisticated the jamming or how well planned the strike, the human element of rapid air support remained the decisive factor. But the deeper lesson was more philosophical. Modern warfare is often described as a digital game played with satellites and long-range sensors. The events in the Wash proved that when the screens go black and the radios hiss with static, the battle returns to its most primitive form. It becomes a matter of grit, a few yards of dirt, and the will of soldiers to stand their ground, until the help they were promised arrives. The Syrian border remained a place of shifting shadows and unspoken rules. The Iranian forces had retreated, their test of American resolve completed, and answered with a violent, explosive clarity. Both sides now moved with a new kind of caution. They had both glimpsed a power that could silence their greatest weapons with a single pulse of light. The desert was empty once more. The wind blew over the pulse, dry wash, erasing the tracks of the boots and the scorched marks of the 30mm shells. The limestone rocks, shattered by the Cornet missile, lay in silent piles. In the high offices of Washington and Tehran, the reports were filed away in vaults that would not be opened for 50 years. The 6-minute gap was closed. The soldiers were back on patrol. The world moved on, unaware of how close it had come, to the edge of a much larger fire. The morning was still. It would stay that way for now.